A professorial lecture needs to do three things. It needs to be rooted in your scholarship and record of teaching. It needs to be quite personal, and it also needs to be accessible to the general public. It needs to be something that's not just understood by specialists in your field or indeed other academics, but can be much more broadly accessible. So those were the things that I was bearing in mind when I was thinking about what topic to have my professorial lecture on. And that's why I chose the subject of contemporary Poland and the question of why does Poland matter? Contemporary Poland is the main core of my academic research. It runs through everything I've done on political parties, on the impact of European integration on national politics, especially Euroscepticism, on my previous and current research on transitional justice, and my future research on religion and politics, as well as being my core area of teaching. It's also very personal to me. Although I was born in this country, I'm from a Polish family. I brought up in an environment where I was immersed in the Polish language, culture, history. Those of my students, people who've taken my courses, will tell you that Eastern Europe, Poland in particular, is something that I not only have an intellectual and academic interest in, but it's something that I've got a very strong emotional commitment to. It's something I feel very passionate about. And as far as making it broadly accessible, as far as a topic that can be of interest to a general audience, well, this is something that as a country specialist, somebody specialising in Poland, who's trying to make their work relevant to a comparative audience. It's something that I'm very used to doing. As a single country specialist, I'm always having to answer what might be called the so what question. What is it about your case that's interesting to somebody who's not interested in your case? In other words, what is it about Poland that's interesting to somebody who's not interested in Poland? So I face that challenge all the time in my academic research, trying to make my work relevant and accessible. So when thinking about Poland and thinking about the aspects of it that are of interest to other people and that matter, I've picked on three areas. Firstly, Poland's experience of democratisation, its transition to democracy, the way the country extracted itself from communist rule, and how it's dealt with the legacy of its communist past and the impact that this has on the quality of post-communist democracy. Secondly, Poland's experience of European integration and its relationship with the European Union, both as a candidate country and as the largest of the 10 new post-communist EU member states that joined in 2004 and 2007. And the third area that I'm looked at is an area that's actually quite distinctive and unique to Poland, and that is the role of the Polish Catholic Church as an institution and of the very high levels of religiosity among Poles, among ordinary Polish public. One of the jobs of the comparativist, of somebody who tries to locate their work within their country study within a comparative framework, is yes, to look for the points of similarity between their case and others, but also to look at the points of difference. What is it that's unique about their case? And it's that third area, the area of Polish, high levels of Polish religiosity and the influential role of the Polish Catholic Church, which is something that's distinctive and unique about Poland. And it's something that interacts with those two other fields, with the question of democratisation and of European integration, and means that they work themselves out in a very particular way. But obviously it limits the extent to which we can draw from Poland's experience as some kind of a model. And when I talk about using Poland as a model, I'm really talking about this in two senses. Firstly, in the analytical sense, are there broader comparative and theoretical lessons that we can draw from the Polish case? So Poland as a kind of comparative model from which broader lessons can be drawn. But also in the the normative sense. Is Poland, are there aspects of the Polish experience of these areas that are something to be emulated, something something that's a source of normative emulation, if you like. So they're the two senses in which I'll be looking at Poland as a model in this lecture, in the analytical and in the normative sense. And I'll jumble these two up. I'll use them fairly interchangeably. So one way that we might be able to draw some broader comparative, normative and analytical lessons from the Polish case is to look upon it as a model of democratic transition, the way the country's extracted itself from communist rule. This year is the 25th anniversary of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. And in Poland, as in much of the rest of the communist bloc, this was a peaceful, negotiated process of transition, exemplified by the so-called round table negotiations between the representatives of the communist regime and the democratic opposition, and the peaceful surrender of power by the former, by the ruling elite into the democratic era. People who study democratization around the world, what you might call comparative transitologists, people who compare transitions to democracy. They're interested in the processes of democratization and regime change. These people often posit what's called pacting between the representatives of the regime and the opposition. They posit these kind of pacting processes, these kind of elite level bargains of the kind of which occurred during the Polish round table negotiations in 1989 as the most desirable, the most normatively desirable model for regime change, because it provides something for everyone, and in particular because it provides a soft landing for representatives of the previous regime, and therefore it contains strong incentives for them not to undermine the new democratic system. So people who study transitions to democracy comparatively look upon cases like the Polish case, the Polish round table negotiations, as a model. And many Poles, indeed, many people in Poland look upon the round table negotiations as a sort of foundational myth for the post-communist Polish state. However, I think there are reasons why we need to be careful about viewing the process of Polish regime change in this way. And one of the reasons for this, I would argue, is the way that the issue of transitional justice, the way that the new communist regime has dealt with the leaders of and functionaries of the previous regime, the way that this has been dealt with, and the way that this, together more generally with the legacy of communist rule, has recurred, has come up again and again as an issue in post-communist politics. And it's this issue, the issue of transitional justice, that I think leads us to put some question marks over this idea of the round table negotiations of a pacted transition to democracy as the most desirable normatively. One of the reasons, as I said, one of the reasons why the transitology literature, why transitologists posit these elite level pacts like the round table negotiations as the most desirable means of moving from one system to another, is because, I said, they give the old elites, the outgoing elites, a stake in the new democratic system. And Poland, post-communist Poland, appeared very much to conform to this idea, the idea of trying to make the old elites feel comfortable within the new democratic settlement. This was very much the approach of the early post-communist governments, exemplified by the so-called thick line policy of the first post-communist Polish Prime Minister, Tadeusz Mazowiecki. Solidarity Intellectual, becomes the first non-communist prime minister in Eastern Europe for more than 40 years. In his inaugural policy speech, talked about drawing a thick line between the communist past and the present and indeed the future. Now, Mazowiecki and his supporters often point out that when he was talking about the thick line, he was really talking about his approach to the economy. He wanted to distance himself from the economic policies of his predecessors and look forward in terms of the kind of economic policies he would pursue. And that's no doubt true. But whatever his intentions, the idea of the thick line, the idea of forgiving and forgetting, of not having a reckoning with the communist past, has become exemplified by the thick line. The thick line has, if you like, become a metaphor for the kind of policies pursued by the early post-communist governments. However, in spite of this thick line policy, in spite of trying to ensure that old elites felt comfortable with the new settlement, the question of how to deal with the communist past, the question of transitional justice, has recurred again and again and again. It's been a recurring issue in Polish politics throughout the 25 years of the democratic transition. Most strikingly over the issue of what might be called lustration. Okay, lustration, this is a word, it's got an interesting etymology. Its origins go back to Roman times. It conjures up images of periodic sacrifices. In fact, its use in the post-communist sense is as a bureaucratic process for vetting individuals for their links with the communist era security services. The communist era the communist regimes spied on their populations on an industrial scale. These were the most spied upon people probably in the history of mankind. They had vast networks of agents and informers spying on their populations, producing miles and miles and miles of files on particular individuals. And for that reason, it's lustration, the question of whether or not public officials and other public authority figures should be vetted for their links with the communist security services, and indeed whether people should have access to the files of the communist security services, is the main way that transitional justice has occurred as an issue in post-communist states, and it's an issue that has recurred again and again and again in Polish politics. 8 years after Tadeusz Mazowiecki declared the thick line dividing the communist past from the present, Poland eventually passes a lustration law, a law for vetting officials for their links with the communist security services. A year later, it passes a law setting up a body called the Institute for National Remembrance, a body to oversee the extant files of the communist security services and to provide people, certain people, with access to them. And then again, in the next decade, in the mid-2000s, in 2006, 2007, an even more radical lustration law is passed, extending that vetting to wider groups of individuals and providing broader access of people to the files of the communist security services. In many ways, it's not surprising, given the vast files that these services held, but also the legacy of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people across the communist bloc who have an involvement in the regime through, as I say, either being agents or informers or collaborators with the security services. It's perhaps not surprising that this issue comes up, as it does again and again. And it has a real capacity to rise up as an issue and knock the political class off balance. A good example of this was in 2008, shortly after the more radical lustration law was passed, when two historians working for the Polish Institute for National Remembrance published a book claiming to contain strong circumstantial evidence that Lech Wałęsa, the legendary leader of the Polish Solidarity trade union and Poland's first president to be elected, freely elected in a post-communist election, that he had been a communist security service informer, codenamed Bolek, in the early 1970s. The two historians, as I say, claim to provide strong circumstantial evidence of this. This is not an original claim, this is a claim that has been coming up for some time, and the two historians also claim that Wałęsa destroyed some of the files implicating him in the beginning of the transition period. But the publication of the book, with the mark, of course, of the Institute of National Remembrance, moves this issue right up the political agenda. These are claims that I should stress Lech Wałęsa and his supporters strenuously deny, and have always strenuously denied. So the recurrence of this issue, the way the issue of transitional justice and of lustration and access to communist security service files recurs constantly, raises questions about whether forgiving and forgetting really is the most effective means of dealing with the communist past. It also raises questions about the state of democracy in post-communist Poland, because at the root of this issue, of the root of the fact that the issue keeps coming up again and again, were broader concerns about the failure of post-communist democratization more generally. Lustration file access was often posited as a project designed to implement democratic renewal and to enhance the quality of post-communist democracy by giving people the right to know what was in the files of their public officials and authority figures, and becoming entwined with other issues such as the need to deal with corruption. So in a sense, it tells us something about the state of democracy in Poland, the fact that this issue keeps coming up again and again and again. It's something that I think I probably underestimated in my earlier work on this issue. I tended just to see the recurrence of the question of lustration as just a symptom of power politics, of politicians using the issue as a club with which to beat their political opponents. And I think I underestimated the extent to which it really is normative concerns about the state of democracy that was driving this issue. The fact that continued and recurrent calls for lustration and file access resonated with a kind of a symbolic, an institutional sense that something about the democratic transition was incomplete. And the fact that Poland embarked upon and continue to embark upon these lustration and file access programs can be perceived as a need as an expression of the need to deepen these processes. In other words, an element of a feeling that far-reaching moral and political renewal was required in post-communist Poland, and thereby questioning the virtues of the thick line policy. Underpinning all of this were concerns about the unsatisfactory nature of the elite bargain, the bargain that led to the collapse of communism. That is, as I say, for many, the foundational myth of the post-communist Polish state. So in terms of Poland serving as a model of democratization, while there are clearly aspects here of the Polish experience that we can draw upon and which comparative transitologists see as a model for emulation, there are also real question marks. There's real question marks about the extent to which an elite pacting process is really the most desirable way to move into a democratic system, and particularly because of the way that it excludes society and the way that the process is felt to create an insufficient reckoning with the communist past, which means that the issue recurs again and again. Another area, a second way if you like, where we might be able to draw lessons from the Polish case has been in Poland's approach to the question of European integration and its relationship with the EU, with the European Union, both, as I say, as a candidate country in the 2000s and from 2004, from the mid 2000s onward, as the largest of the post-communist new EU member states. EU membership, joining the EU, was the main foreign policy goal of all the post-1989 Polish governments, right up until Polish accession in the mid 2000s. Poland was in the vanguard, if you like, of those post-communist states wanting to integrate their countries into Western international structures, a process that's sometimes referred to colloquially as returning to Europe, the return to Europe. And more recently, in recent years, Poland has been seen by many, particularly by Europhiles, by supporters of the European integration process, as a model European. And this has particularly been evident since 2007, since the current government led by the centrist Civic Platform Party took office and made a conscious effort to locate Poland within the so-called European mainstream, put the country at the vanguard of the European integration project. In other words, to try and make the country, as I've put it elsewhere, as part of the title of my book on this topic, the new heart of Europe, the new heart of Europe. And for many, the appointment of Polish Prime Minister and Civic Platform leader Donald Tusk as the new president of the European Union Council, his appointment at the end of August and taking office at the beginning of December, for many of them this was the crowning achievement, if you like, of Poland's model European status, of the current government's mainstreaming strategy, putting the country at the vanguard of European integration. His promotion to that position was seen as the centrepiece, if you like, of the success of that strategy. Proponents of this school of thought, people who look upon Poland as a model for European integration, also point to the high levels of popular support, the high levels of support for EU membership among the general public. Something that's particularly important at a time when European publics are felt to be, when the European project is felt to be in crisis and European publics are felt to be increasingly sceptical about the European project. In 2003, Poles voted overwhelmingly by a proportion of over 3-1 in an accession referendum to join the EU. And since then, support for EU membership has if anything, increased. An agency, a polling agency called CEBOS, which has done a tracking poll on Polish support for EU membership right since Poland submitted its EU application in 1994, found that after EU accession, support for EU membership in Poland went up to record levels, to something like 80 to 90% of Poles being in favour of their country being a member of the EU, with opponents of EU membership in Poland being around 5 to 10%. So the idea, if you like, of Poland as a model European, both at the elite level, but also at the level of the general public. However, this idea of Poland as the model European, this hides the fact, it masks the fact that actually there is and has always been an extremely sharp debate within Poland about EU policy and about approaches to European integration. In other words, there's always been an underlying tension between this idea of this view of Poland and many Polish Europhiles' self-image of Poland as the new heart of Europe, and a certain awkwardness about Poland's relationship with the EU. The idea of Poland as the new awkward partner, a UK-style awkward partner. Indeed, that's the title of a monograph I published on this, was Poland, New Heart of Europe or New Awkward Partner. And this This sense of awkwardness was particularly evident in the years 2005 to 2007, a period when the right-wing Law and Justice Party, led by Jarosław Kaczyński, was in office. At the same time, his twin brother, Lech Kaczyński, was also president of Poland. So you had a period between 2005 and 2007 when you had Law and Justice in government and Lech Kaczyński as the president. And he continues to be president until he dies tragically in an air crash in Smolensk in Western Russia, where he's visiting the graves of Polish soldiers murdered by the Soviet NKVD during the war. But you get a period between 2006, 2007. If you want to know what's interesting about Poland, well, one thing that's distinctive is that you get a period when twin brothers are actually the Prime Minister and the President of Poland between 2006, 2007. And it's that period, and more broadly the period between 2005 and 2007, that's often looked at as that key period, if you like, of awkwardness in terms of Poland's relationship with the EU. That government was very critical of. It contained political parties that were very critical of, indeed some that were even more hostile than Law and Justice to the EU and the European integration project. It was a government that was willing to adopt an extremely assertive approach to defending what it perceived to be as Poland's national interests, and more generally was quite comfortable, quite prepared to stand outside the dominant West European social liberal consensus, if you like, or at least the consensus that dominates the West European cultural and political and media establishment. They were quite comfortable about standing outside this social liberal consensus. Now, arguably, one take on this is that this awkwardness was just an episode. Okay, it was just a brief episode. The current government, if you like, the Civic Platform government, represents a return to normality, the normality of Poland as a model European. But I think the problem with this argument is that it underestimates, it ignores the fact that there is a tension, a constant tension that lies at the heart of Poland's relationship with the EU, that pulls it between being the new heart of Europe and a new awkward partner. And that tension, which I would argue is still there and hasn't gone away, is the dissonance, the disconnect, if you like, between, on the one hand, Poland's size, its size both geographically and demographically in terms of population, and its concomitant aspirations to play the role of a major power, particularly a regional leader within the EU. A tension between that and its ability to be able to deliver on that prospectus. In other words, it's economic, and linked to that it's geopolitical clout. Okay, so the country lacks the capacity, still lacks the capacity, in spite of recent economic growth, in spite of this claim to be at the heart of Europe, to deliver on that agenda, on its self-image of itself as a major EU player, and its agenda of being a regional leader. The current government has tried to finesse this approach, this problem, by holding tight to Germany, by allying Poland with the major EU powers, and particularly with Germany. And many argue that the Mr. Tusk's appointment as the EU president is, as I say, the crowning achievement of that, and as a fruit of the close relationship that he has with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. However, some critics would argue that in a sense this crowning achievement of the EU's of the current government's and those who think in that way's mainstreaming strategy is actually overblown. It's more a success for Mr. Tusk personally than it is for Poland. They argue that the EU Council presidency is a largely technical, a symbolic job. And it doesn't really, they argue, move forward much in terms of influencing the EU's policy and priorities. Otherwise, they argue, Mr. Tusk wouldn't have been given the job. So there's real questions as to whether the mainstreaming strategy of the current government really finesses that problem, which, as I say, I think is a fundamental one, that tension between Poland as a new awkward partner and Poland as the new heart of Europe, the tension between its size and its aspirations. Looking at the level of public opinion, moving down from the elite level for the moment, I think it's also worth pausing for a moment and unpicking a little bit why it is that Poles are so supportive of the European Union. Why do Poles appear to be such a Europhile people, at least from these figures about support for public support for EU membership? Well, I think there are really two reasons for this. There are two reasons for the continuing high levels of support for Polish membership. The first of these is the idea of European integration and of joining the EU as a civilizational choice. Okay, it's as a kind of symbolic reuniting with a West that Poles have always considered themselves to be part of culturally and spiritually, captured in that slogan, the idea of returning to Europe. I think that this came across most powerfully in a campaign advertisement that was run during the 2003 EU accession referendum by the government. For my sins, one of the things I have to do, I have to watch the Polish news every night. I watch all the election broadcasts, and during that referendum I watched all the broadcasts produced by the yes and the no campaigns, and there was a particularly powerful one that stood out, I think, which presented a series of images, beginning with the election of Karol Wojtyła as Pope in 1978, as Pope John Paul II, and of his historic visit to Poland a year later in 1979, a visit that leads to the formation of the Solidarity trade union, so images of the shipyard strike that lead to the formation of Solidarity, of people voting in the May-June 1989 semi-free parliamentary elections, the partially contested, partially elections, which follow on, of course, from the round table negotiations, and where Poles vote to reject the Communist Party overwhelmingly, culminating in an image of the then Polish Prime Minister, Leszek Miller, signing the 2003 Polish EU accession treaty. Okay, in other words, representing Poland's accession to the European Union as the logical culmination of that whole process of democratization, of a chain of events leading back historically, back to the 1970s and if not before. This captures, if you like, this idea of the civilizational choice that Poles were making. And this made it very difficult, this kind of narrative made it very difficult for Polish Eurosceptics, for Polish opponents of integration into the European Union, to argue against, to construct an alternative narrative, because it looked like what they were arguing against was arguing against the grain, if you like, the logic of history. European integration was presented as part of the logic of history and the culmination of the process of post-communist democratization. And it also constructed a very powerful narrative of the idea of Polishness and of Europeanness as being natural partners, of being complementary identities, if you like, rather than contradictory identities. So a very powerful historical narrative that made it very difficult for Eurosceptics to argue against, but also made it difficult to look at Poland as an obvious model in cases where that civilizational choice isn't so self-evident. Okay, maybe unlike the United Kingdom, for example, where it's perfectly possible to construct an equally, if not more, Eurosceptics might argue, plausible, indeed highly attractive historical narrative that doesn't include European integration into the European Union. Okay, so it was a very powerful narrative, this idea of the EU as a historical civilizational choice, but also one that limits the extent to which Poland can be seen as a model for Europeans, supporters of European integration. So that's one reason for high levels of European support for European integration. The other reason, the second reason for continuing high levels of support for Polish EU membership is, I think, the fact that the EU has realised the very modest, realistic, some would say pessimistic expectations that Poles had of what the EU would actually deliver in concrete terms. If you look at the polling, if you look at what Poles expected the EU to deliver, they were actually very, very realistic about this. Some would say very pessimistic about this. But there was one area where they expected the EU to deliver, and that was the ability to travel and to work abroad, and particularly free movement of labour and travel. And the EU has delivered on this. Captured, I suppose, but best by, or at least early on, best by the image of the Polish plumber, the famous Polish plumber used by the campaigners in France against the EU constitutional treaty in 2005 to help them defeat that in a referendum, and manifested itself, perhaps most notably, in mass Polish migration to the United Kingdom. So Poles expected to be able to travel and to work abroad, and the EU has delivered on this. But the problem with this is that the problem with Poles having this view about very specific things that they wanted out the EU is it means that Polish support for European integration, Polish Europhilia, is clearly highly contingent. Okay, it's highly contingent and perhaps could come under strain as the benefits start to wear off, and in particular if the Union were to cease to deliver on access to Western labour markets. And of course West European governments are coming under increasing pressure from their populations to curb unrestricted access of East Europeans, like Poles in particular, and others indeed, to their labour markets and to their welfare systems. Moreover, and perhaps just as importantly, this something that was seen as a success at one time, the opportunity to be able to work abroad, is arguably seen by many Poles increasingly as a sign of failure. Okay, and particularly by a younger generation of Poles who in some ways have come to take the ability to work abroad for granted, and in many ways actually see it as presenting them with a rather invidious choice between, on the one hand, moving to take jobs that many of them consider to be well below their capabilities and aspirations, or on the other hand, remaining in Poland in a country that offers them few prospects for the future. So in many ways this actually highlights one of the problems, if you like, that Poles perceive now exists. The ability to travel and work abroad brings into sharp relief the stark choice that many young people face. At the same time, the idea of Poland as a civilizational choice is also something that's come under increasing strain. Partly, I think, because certainly among many Poles, there's an increasing sense of cultural distinctiveness about Poland. Okay, and in particular, this is true in terms of the country's moral and cultural and civilizational values. In other words, many Poles feel that they're increasingly distinct from the social liberal, the liberal left, if you like, values that dominate, that they perceive to dominate Western Europe, and certainly its cultural and media establishment. In other words, it's far from clear that the kind of civilizational choices that Poles want to make are the choices that are being made in Western Europe. And indeed, that therefore the idea of Polishness and Europeanness as complementary logics, as complementary identities, may actually be no longer the case, that Polishness and Europeanness may increasingly be clashing. I'll say a little bit more about this when I talk about the role of religion and the Catholic Church in Poland. So this is obviously this sense of kind of cultural and social distinctiveness, well, moral distinctiveness. Obviously, it's something you'd expect among the more socially and culturally conservative elements in Polish society. But in many ways, it also ties in with a broader feeling of the younger, the post-enlargement generation, if you like, who, rather than the EU symbolising civilizational progress, socio-economic modernisation, the kind of solidarity, if you like, the thing that Poles were promised at the time of EU accession, rather see the European Union, or many of them see the European Union, increasingly as a kind of a stifling bureaucracy and representing political and cultural oppression. A good indication, a nice, interesting kind of straw in the wind, was the high vote for a party called the Congress of the New Right, led by a veteran eccentric of the Polish political scene called Janusz Korwin-Mikke. This is a party that's very economically libertarian, believes in a small minimal state, but is also very socially conservative and radically Eurosceptic. Okay, radically Eurosceptic. And it was the Congress of the New Right, led by Janusz Korwin-Mikke, who argued that the best thing that you could do with the European Parliament would be to turn it into a brothel, because he thought that would be more useful than its current function. This party, in the May 2014 European Parliament elections, actually won the largest share of the vote among younger voters, among first-time voters. So a straw in the wind, an interesting straw in the wind about the attitudes of that post-enlargement generation that no longer sees Europe as that kind of civilizational choice so obviously, and the opportunity to work abroad as such an obvious benefit. Now, the final area that I'd like to look at is the role of the Catholic Church in contemporary Poland, both in terms of the high levels of religiosity among Poles, as measured by attendance, regular attendance at Mass, which are very high in Poland, and also the key role that the Church has played as an institution in contemporary Polish politics. It's this role, the unique role of the Polish Catholic Church and of the religiosity of Polish society that has, I would argue, been critical to our understanding of these two other processes of democratization and European integration. And it also highlights Poland's uniqueness. Okay? Apart from making sure these two processes played themselves out in particular ways, it also draws our attention to the fact that the limitations in which we can see Poland as a model of European integration and of democratic transition. In terms of democratization, the Catholic Church as an institution plays a pivotal role in helping to broker these round table negotiations that, as we saw, were so critical to the process of democratic transition. And before that, it plays a vital organisational role in terms of moral support for the Polish solidarity movement and the democratic transition. The solidarity movement, which by many is itself seen as a model of how a democratic opposition movement should organise itself against a non-democratic regime, and as a statement of a sort of massive statement of non-violent moral delegitimation of a regime by a society. Solidarity is very difficult to understand without understanding the role of the Catholic Church. The kind of religious imagery that was evident during the shipyard strikes in Gdańsk, the open-air masses, the use of religious symbols, the Virgin Mary, pictures of Pope John Paul II. Indeed, it's Pope John Paul II's visit in 1979 that's the precursor to the formation of Solidarity in 1980. It's the very religiosity of Solidarity that makes it a unique, some would argue, a sui generis social movement representing a particular constellation of political and social forces. So solidarity plays the Catholic Church plays a particular role in the formation of solidarity, and then subsequently in the round table negotiations that lead to democratisation in Poland. The Church also plays an important role in debates on European integration in Poland. But this role is an interesting one. Indeed, it's a very complex and a rather ambiguous one. Indeed, some would argue it's a contradictory one. Because on the one hand, the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, priests, the laity played a key role in garnering Polish support for integration into the European Union, arguably playing a key role in securing a yes vote for Poland's accession to the EU in 2003. And the most striking example of this was again an intervention by Pope John Paul II in the middle of the referendum campaign, addressing an audience in Rome, which included many Poles. Pope John Paul II makes a dramatic intervention, coining the slogan, from the Union of Lublin to the European Union. Okay, the Union of Lublin is a treaty that unites the Kingdom of Poland with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in the 16th century, creating one of the largest states in Europe. And by doing this, by drawing an analogy between this historic period of Polish greatness in earlier times and the process of European integration, in a sense it kind of played into, it dovetailed really nicely with the narrative that supporters of European integration were putting forward. It reinforced that message of Europe as a civilizational choice of historic proportions. So on the one hand, the Church is playing a very important role, and John Paul II in particular, in generating support for European integration. On the other hand, Poland is interesting, it's distinctive, quite possibly unique, in seeing the emergence of a religiously inspired Eurosceptic movement. Okay, a religiously inspired Eurosceptic movement clustered around a Polish radio station, a Catholic broadcaster called Radio Maria, run by a Redemptorist monk called Father Tadeusz Rydzyk, which has, depending on estimates, 1 to 2 million very loyal and politically mobilised listeners, an associated television station, an associated daily newspaper, and a web of civil society organisations, in fact a conglomerate, if you like, putting across a Eurosceptic critique based on a religious discourse, but associating the EU with Western secularism and social liberalism. And this is interesting and striking in many ways, because in Western Europe we're used to seeing expressions, if you like, of political Catholicism, of the political organisation of Catholics in Christian democracy, a current that's traditionally been very supportive of European federalism and of European integration. So a complex and rather contradictory set of attitudes towards European integration. And what explains this? Why does the Church play this rather complex and contradictory role, and how is this likely to develop in the future? Well, at the heart of this, the key to explaining this is the tension that's felt, the unease that's felt by many Poles, by many Polish clergymen and by many of the laity about the kind of developments, the processes and phenomena that they associate increasingly with Western Europe and with West European secularism. Okay, the kind of empty churches that we're used to seeing in Western Europe, consumerism, individualism, the sexual revolution, changing attitudes towards individual morality, the rights and place in society of sexual minorities, and the implications of this for the traditional models and notions of marriage and the family, and the threat to what John Paul II would call the culture of life, coming from phenomena such as the increased availability of artificial contraception, in vitro fertilization, abortion and euthanasia. Okay, so part of it is concerns about these particular processes, and also the extent to which, no doubt that by many Poles felt to represent a threat to Western, to European civilizations, but it's concerned about the extent to which these are linked to European integration. In other words, the key to understanding Polish church attitudes towards European integration, and the key to understanding how it will develop in the future, whether it will be more or less supportive, is the extent to which, on the one hand, the European Union is felt to be an organisation that's contributing and strengthening these kind of dangerous, in the eyes of many Polish Catholics, civilizational processes through its institutions and its policies. To the extent that that's seen to be the case, there'll be increased hostility to integration with Europe, or the extent to which these processes are seen to be on separate tracks. So the extent to which the European integration project is felt to be separate from these other civilizational processes that are felt to, the extent to which they're developing on separate tracks. To that extent, there'll be a greater openness towards European integration. So how is this likely to develop in the future? Well, the big, and indeed how is the role of the Polish Catholic Church likely to develop in the future? Well, the big question really, the big open question here, is whether Poland can buck this trend, buck the trend of secularism, of the emptying churches that has swept across much of Europe, and which, as I say, many fear European integration is a process that will accelerate this. Or will Poland maintain its uniqueness, its high levels of religiosity, and the church as a significant actor? Well, clearly, the church is much more contested as an actor. Its role is much more contested in society than it was at one time. There's also been a steady, a continuous decline in church attendance, and many would argue that Polish religiosity is now more culturally reflexive rather than spiritually deep. You're getting the evidence of what you might call the privatization of religion in Poland, and plenty of evidence of a dissonance between church teachings on issues such as sexual morality, birth control, in vitro fertilization, what some people call the privatization of religion, or cafeteria Catholicism, if you like, people picking and choosing the aspects of the bits of church teaching that they like. There's clearly evidence of this in Poland, secularization and the privatization of religion and cafeteria Catholicism. On the other hand, church attendance in Poland remains pretty high. It's fallen from over 50% 25 years ago at the beginning of the transition, but more than 40% of Poles, around about 40% of Poles attending at least once a week a church service, it remains relatively high by European standards. And perhaps even more importantly, Catholicism remains very strongly bound up in many people's minds with a sense of Polishness. Okay, Polishness and Catholicism are very tightly linked. Okay, culturally, even if Poles aren't necessarily always faithful to the Catholic Church's teaching, it's still considered by many an important part of Catholicism is considered an important part of being Polish culturally for many Poles, and this is important. And also, again in European terms, Poles are very socially conservative. Okay, they still, in spite of the cafeteria Catholicism, they still remain much more conservative on moral, cultural issues. And there's also some evidence of a trend away from cafeteria Catholicism on some issues. Abortion is probably the best issue, where in the 1990s opinion was much more divided on this question, but in recent years it's hardened considerably, okay, against abortion, against a liberal approach to abortion. So where does this all lead us? Well, does Poland matter? Well, Poland certainly matters. The question is not whether it matters or not. The question is how it matters. Does it provide us with a model for understanding democratisation and European integration processes, both analytically and normatively? Or is the situation so complex, is it so problematic when one looks beneath the surface? There's simply too many unique elements that make it difficult to draw meaningful lessons and conclusions from the Polish case. Well, ostensibly, on the one hand, that there are certainly ways in which we can find elements of the Polish experience of democratisation and European integration, which suggest that the country can serve as a model in both normative and analytical terms. That there are broader conclusions and lessons we can draw from the Polish case. The way it extracted itself from communist rule, which means that it's often seen as a model of peaceful democratic transition, a peaceful democratic transition that has ensured that that democracy in Poland is embedded and entrenched, a certain level of stability in Poland, with no significant actors, no representatives of the former ruling elite wanting a return to the status quo ante or opposing, in broadly speaking, the liberal democratic model. From the perspective of supporters of European integration, for Euro enthusiasts, Poland can be seen as a model, both in terms of the political but also cultural elites who've located themselves within and attempted to integrate the country into the European mainstream, but also at the popular level, at the high levels of popular support for EU membership in Poland, rooted, as I said, in strong part at least, in this idea of European integration as a civilizational choice, in which Polishness and Europeanness are seen as complementary logics, as complementary identities. On the other hand, while the Polish Round Table negotiations can be seen by and have been seen by many as a model of a successful transition, the Polish elite bargain, which exemplified by these processes and which meant that transitional justice was delayed in these countries, has contributed to a feeling among many Poles that nothing has really changed. This, if you like, highlights the risks of attempting to disenfranchise society from the process of regime change. Indeed, the recurrence of concerns about transitional justice, particularly, as I say, the issue of lustration and file access, suggests that there are problems with forgiving and forgetting as a model for new democracies in terms of dealing with the old regimes, and maybe indicative of a wider unease about the quality of post-communist democracy that's emerging in Poland. The idea of Poland as a model European conflicts with the awkwardness in Poland's relationship with the European Union, which, as I say, stems from that ill fit between the country's size and aspirations on the one hand and its economic and geopolitical clout, its ability to deliver on those aspirations on the other. This paradox that pulls Poland between being a new European and an awkward partner is also potentially evident when one looks at public opinion. With Polish Europhilia, Polish support for the EU being highly contingent, with the benefits of membership of the European Union less obvious than they were at one time and increasingly perceived by many, particularly the post-enlargement younger generation, as a sign of the country's weakness and failure rather than success, and the civilizational choice, which was posited by many supporters of European integration, the idea of Polishness and Europeanness as complementary logics, are not as obvious as they once were, and arguably becoming less so. And finally, the role of the Polish Catholic Church, the high, apparently enduring levels of religiosity, is something that's unique to Poland, and it's made all of these processes work themselves out differently. Okay, although whether they continue to be a feature of Polish exceptionism is obviously open to question. So the answer to the question, whether or not does Poland provide a model for democratic transition and European integration in the normative sense? Well, my answer to that question would be the same as the answer that a Polish archbishop, the Archbishop of Warsaw, gave when asked whether or not the Polish Catholic Church supported Poland's integration into the European Union. And his answer was yes, but, with an emphasis on the but. Okay. And it's the but as much as the yes that makes the Polish case interesting and important to understand if we want to make sense of contemporary Europe. In other words, ironically, it's the uniqueness of the Polish case that means that we can draw insights and learn from it and learn lessons and insights about other cases. Thank you.